through this morning's papers. Joining us is former Liberal Democrat Minister Norman Baker and former Conservative advisor Claire Pearsall. Morning to you both.
Morning.
Morning, Claire. Let's start with you, Claire. In the Express, Richie gets it. Pensioners at forefront of my mind. Triple lock.
The triple lock, and will please quite a lot of the Conservative electorate. I would assume that's what he's going for. I think it's right that we look after pensioners. I think the problem he has is when you're talking about those pensioners who are perhaps incredibly well off, still working, and don't need quite the amount of assistance that the government is giving. But I do think that for the majority, the triple lock was a manifesto promise. He is quite right to keep that in. We don't understand how this is going to relate to those on benefits, because it was always a case of, do you look after the pensioners? Do you look after those claiming benefits? That's a little bit unclear, but I think that this is one of the sort of surest signs that Rishi does understand what needs to be done, does understand what a manifesto promise is, which we've not seen for a long time. So I think this is a really positive view from him. I think Norman is desperate to come in, and he's going to disagree.
A lot of pensioners are wealthy. I've said it a lot of times on the show. Of course, a lot aren't. I think about 20% of pensioners are really struggling. But I think there's a greater proportion of poverty in working households where there are often children than there are pensioners who won't be getting this package.
It would be outrageous if benefits didn't go up in line with inflation, and pensions do, because if you say there are a lot of rich pensioners, there are people who are pensioners living in the south of Spain getting no fuel allowance. That cannot be right under any circumstances. And look, this is not about paying a debt to pensioners, but that's how the government addresses it. This is about votes. This is because people who are of pensionable age, by the way, I'm 65, so I'm going to get my pension very shortly. This is about making sure that people who are pensioners, who by and large vote Conservative, continue to vote Conservative. That's what this is about.
Well, there needs to be a bit of politics, doesn't there, in all of this, because they're delivering a very difficult to swallow budget, aren't they, on Thursday, or autumn statement, and there has to be a little bit of thinking about the election. Otherwise, it's going to be a disaster for the Conservatives.
Well, of course, you always need to have one eye on that, but also it is right to look after some of the most vulnerable in the country. And as you say, there is this big divide. There are those pensioners who are still working and that can afford to live their lives and heat their homes, but there are a majority that can't. And I think to forget that part of the population is just wrong.
And actually, to bring that in takes us to the story that Norman wants to focus on, which is the Daily Telegraph. Households face steep increase in council tax, and this increase in council tax is to pay for social care, a lot of which goes on caring for the elderly.
Well, look, I'm in a cynical mood this morning. This is about shifting blame for increases in the cost of living onto local councils, or whatever colour they happen to be, because the government wants the councils to be blamed. It's not a new tactic. It's been going for 50 years. The government has lowered councils with responsibilities. But of course you've got to pay for social care. But one of the problems is that there isn't enough money, even with 4.99% increase for social care. And councils, and I used to lead a council in Lewis, councils have been hollowed out. The capacity they had to deliver services and make real choices has by and large gone. This isn't a party point. It's the same for whatever council is run by whatever party. It's terrible. But what's happened is, because councils are so stretched for money, the statutory services have to be funded because that's the law, and anything which is non-statutory is gone by the board. So, for example, I'm interested in buses in my campaign for better transport role. They're not a statutory function, so buses are being slashed. 50% of council bus services have been cut in the last 10 years. It's terrible.
And news in one of the papers this morning, I'm not sure which, that two Conservative-run councils are on the brink of bankruptcy, Kent and Hampshire.
That's
right. Can't happen. What happens if that...
Well, I mean, and this remains to be seen. What does happen if a council goes bankrupt? It is completely unprecedented, and I don't think that the government quite understand what that means either. It's the front page of the Guardian, and it's actually my County Council Roger Goff for Kent, and Hampshire's leader Rob Humby have written a letter in the strongest terms saying, what do we do when it comes to this? And because, as Norma said, the statutory requirements upon these councils to provide education, healthcare and all of those services, child services, adult services, what happens if they physically cannot afford to fund it? I don't think it's as simple as going to the council taxpayer and saying you need to pay at least £100 more a year. That isn't going to cut it. when you're looking at millions and millions of pounds in debt, this is really quite serious. And I don't think that anybody has thought what the solution is, but also if this can actually happen or not.
Norman, what have you heard from your contacts about potentially other councils, not just Hampshire and Kent? Is this the tip of the iceberg?
Well, look, councils are delivering, in many cases, very poor services, not because they're incompetent or because councils don't know or care what their electorate is. They're having your money. And you know, in my area, we've now got a shared chief executive. We've got one enforcement officer for planning infringements across 2 authorities. We used to have 3 or 4 per authority. They can't do anything. There's no capacity there anymore.
But equally, residents cannot afford to continue paying more and more council tax for less and less return.
No, exactly right. That's exactly right. And unfortunately, what's happened is over the last 12 years, and this is partly due to the coalition as well, I might say, that councils have taken the brunt of cuts from central government. And while people have been able to defend, say, the defence budget, the Defence Secretary is quite active at defending the defence budget, people have defended the health budget, no one's been really standing up and defending council budgets, and the consequences is they've had the worst cuts. But they deliver essential services for local people. And I think, Claire, I'm not, unless my memory's wrong, didn't Northamptonshire go bust due to incompetence actually around everything else a while back?
They did, yeah. I mean, there was some misuse of funds. It was all sorts of problems up in Northamptonshire, and they were taken over almost in special measures as schools are. So I wonder if that's kind of the same. I don't think it was quite on this scale, though.
No.
But yes, there is that precedent been set for that council and was taken over, and they seem to be recovering slowly. But it is 2 enormous councils that we're looking at, and I suspect there will be more to come. I can't see that these will be the only 2.
No, they won't be. And of course, the social care underfunding, which won't be sorted by, as you rightly say, won't be sorted by this, feeds into the health service, because what we have is all sorts of what used to be called bed blocking. People don't like the term, but effectively people can't be released from hospital. They're sitting in ambulances, they're sitting in corridors for hours and hours because people who should be discharged cannot be discharged.
Yeah, councils are struggling, everyone's struggling.
Public services creaking.
And that's why front page of the Times, Rishi Sunak will help poorest by boosting living wage, which is great for those employees, but for employers, it's an added cost.
It is an added cost, but those employers will still need to employ people. So I think that it's not quite as bad. When the living wage was introduced, I know that there were the concerns that if you introduce this, then people would lose their jobs, there would be mass unemployment, and of course that didn't happen. So I think...
Does this not stoke inflation, though? And I think it was always hard if you're saying helping the poorest to criticise it for stoking inflation. But we're all being told, aren't we? Nobody can have a pay rise because it's inflationary.
Yes, I mean, as to what degree it's going to affect inflation that already hasn't happened. I mean, I think this is sort of a drop in the ocean in comparison to other measures which do increase inflation, much more. I think this is great. What I am concerned about are those people in the middle who are not getting benefits, who are being squeezed for more money every single time, and they are the ones at the moment who are going to be hit hardest by this. So yes, we need to look after the vulnerable, but don't forget those in the middle who will just not be able to cope.
There's talk of this 8 million households getting cost of living payments of up to 1,100. Is that in addition to the energy bailout?
This is extra money to help those households, and it's one of those things that was always mooted around and is targeted better, which is always what the government wanted. I think it's a very complicated system to try and help households. Everybody has to get it, or you have to spend a lot of time working out the means testing process. So I think they are starting to do it, and it will be targeted better, which is exactly what it needs to be. As we said, we don't need very, very wealthy pensioners getting all this money when they don't need it, and there's somebody living hand to mouth with no heating.
The one point Claire's absolutely right on is that people who are often in work and doing essential jobs like nurses are now visiting food banks because of the cost of living. So this food banks has traditionally been for people who've been out of work and have got little money. You're finding people now who are employed going to food banks. That's the state that we got into. So there is an issue. There is a real issue about people on relatively low wages not able to afford basic necessities.
And you mentioned nurses there, which leads us on to a story you've chosen in the Mail this morning, Norman, about nurses being forced out of hotel rooms to make way for asylum seekers. And the argument is that this deal with France really has to work. Otherwise, it's nurses that will pay the ultimate price.
Yes, well, it's right that we've got to deal with France. I mean, they are our closest neighbour. The government's been quite rude to France unnecessarily for about 5 years, and Rishi Sunak appears to be trying to correct correct that, which is useful. He's doing that. In terms of this is a catastrophe for the government to be forcing nurses out of.
This is foreign nurses that the Home Office
Yes.
were putting up whilst they were training to try and plug the shortfall in nurses, and they've been given a month's notice, is it?
Yes, and also the RNLI have got people in hotels who also they're volunteers who are being trained to save people from the seas, who are being forced to leave a hotel in the Wirral, which is rather ironic. So this is not a good story for the government. The basic point is that the number of asylum seekers coming into the country, which by the way is quite low compared to the European average. We would take far fewer asylum seekers than say Germany or France. But the people coming in are not being processed properly or quickly enough. And they should be processed much more speedily. And there's a huge backlog. And that's the root of the problem. If you had people who were processed quickly, then this problem would largely go away, in my view. And also, I've always taken the view that people who are waiting for a claim to be determined, why don't we let them work rather than be able to claim money? Why don't they work?
Yeah, Claire, there seems to be a number of problems here, exacerbating the other problems, and they're kind of focused around hotels. The hospitality industry is suffering a recruitment crisis, right? And then we've got migrants backing up and having to be put in hotels, which are then replacing nurses, which have come here to train because there's also a recruitment problem in the care sector. There's it's like a myriad of problems coalescing around hotels.
It is a complete house of cards, and I think the problem is that hotels are very expensive. People don't want their hotels to be taken up, but at the moment, with the hospitality sector as it is, some of those hotels wouldn't be in business. And I think we have to look at the cold hard truth on this, that some of them require this. But what is unacceptable is that we have asked for migrant workers to come, train, be nurses, we want to look after them, we want them in our health service. They're now being pushed out by other asylum seekers and migrants and refugees who haven't got the ability to work. And I do disagree with you, Norman, I'm really sorry, but you can't actually give them the right to work as soon as they come into the country. It causes you so many issues. They have a footprint within the state. It means that they will be entitled to certain benefits. So whilst their claim is being progressed, to allow them to work causes you more problems than it solves.
The trouble
There's
is
real technicalities with this.
I understand that. The problem is that some of them are waiting over a year.
And they are allowed to work once their claim has been... if they haven't had their claim assessed within 12 months, they are allowed to work as long as it's on the shortage occupation list.
Yeah. Well, 12 months is a long time to wait. And I come back to the root issue. If they were processed within a month or 3 weeks, they wouldn't have to work. Because it'd be
we should state both of you have had experience in the Home Office, haven't you?
Yes.
You were a minister in the Home Office and you were an advisor, so you both know this subject intensely. When it comes to why it's taking so long to process these asylum claims, is it to do with this slavery law and this loophole that Theresa May introduced and is being abused quite cleverly, some argue, by particularly perhaps Albanian legal migrants?
There is certainly a part that it plays, and you have to look at those kind of claims very carefully if there is any sort of slavery, trafficking type allegation being made. But I think the major problem is trying to find out the identities of individuals in the first place, work with the countries that they have come from. Quite often, if you're looking to get paperwork and confirmation from like Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, that's incredibly difficult. These countries don't work quickly. So there are an awful lot of things to put in place, but I think also that we just don't have the caseworkers with the knowledge to do the claims in the first place, and they are very, very difficult.
And Paul, you've recently been to one of the camps, haven't you, in Dunkirk, where there were lots of people backed up waiting to come to the UK, and you spoke to a guy who'd been working in Germany and been booted out by the Germans, wanted to come to the UK, but because he'd lost all his papers in, where was it, Iraq, under Saudi?
In Iraq, So essentially he's now trying to get to the UK on one of these boats, so he can, but he doesn't have the paperwork, and he's hoping that the authorities over here can somehow get hold of his paperwork in Iraq because the Germans haven't been able to. He's kind of documentless.
Yeah, and I think this is the problem, is that so many people almost become stateless in this respect because they can't get the paperwork requirements from their own home country, so they're hoping that the British government, the German government, the French government, whoever it may be, can fix that. And that is where your real difficulty lies, because those countries aren't going to hand over those details, and they're going to say, give us the person back. And you're in a real
Just quickly on what you were saying about why they shouldn't be allowed to work while they're waiting for the asylum application process. I do understand that, but is it not within the government's power to allow them to work but not claim benefits?
The problem is to come into our system, you need some kind of identification for a start. So you're looking at, you need identification, you'll be given a national insurance number in order for payroll to be supporting you through. And if you don't have that document, we've all started a job and we all have to give national insurance number, dates of birth, passport numbers, you name it, pieces of identification. If you don't have that, it's very difficult.
Is it not possible then to enforce the general principle that you can't claim, but we're happy for you to pay?
But I think the problem is it automatically does that. You start having a national insurance number.
I see what you mean, okay.
You're automatically then enrolled in that system, and that's where it could lead to abuse. It couldn't in some cases, but I think there is an enormous risk. And look at the population in the United Kingdom who need to get a job as well.
Yeah.
So you start to have those real difficulties, and I think communities will pull apart even further if they start seeing people taking over.
Yeah, and just lastly, because we do have to move on to our next segment, but Suella Braverman, a controversial character, was lots of criticism sometimes of her language. But do you get the sense, Norman, as a Liberal, that she really wants to try and sort this problem out? Because it is a huge problem at the moment.
I get the sense that she feels there's a political necessity to sort it out, and there certainly is, because I think it's hemorrhaging votes among Tory voters. I think, to be fair, it's Rishi Sunak who wants to sort it out rather than Suella Braverman.
Okay.
Norman, Claire, thank you very much. More from Norman and Claire in the next hour. It is 10 to 7.